Hi everyone, I wanted to put together a few slides to summarize some of the remaining Quiz 1 content. So first off, I wanted to give you some content related to this objective, select the differences between the two types of relational training procedures, a respondent conditioning procedure and a more traditional match to sample procedure. So far in this class, we've mostly talked about transformation of stimulus function that occurs through operant procedures. So for example, stimulus A is established as a reinforcer through direct training. If money functions as a reinforcer, we might directly train a participant using a match to sample procedure that money is the same as the stimulus A, or that if you pick A, you get money. Then we train that A equals B and B equals C. Then we can present C by itself and test whether it functions as a reinforcer. That would allow us to see whether transformation of stimulus function has occurred. But it's also possible for an RFT procedure to establish a derived eliciting function through a respondent conditioning pairing procedure. We'll be learning about a study that used this procedure next time we're all in class together. A respondent conditioning procedure involves a direct pairing of a stimulus with an established stimulus function with a neutral stimulus. For example, an unconditioned stimulus could be the striking of a participant's knee, which elicits a knee-jerk reflex. Each time we strike the participant's knee, we also play a tone. Eventually, the tone by itself comes to function as a conditioned stimulus that elicits the knee-jerk response. Then relations are trained, so for example, that the tone equals B and B equals C. Then when we present C alone, we can see if it elicits that same knee-jerk response. So in these two examples, there are relations that are directly trained between stimuli, and there are relations that are derived too. The difference is in how stimulus function is established, whether it's through operant conditioning, giving a rule, or through a respondent conditioning procedure. There's a short assignment for you to complete this week where you write out an explanation of what each of these procedures would look like. And I'll give you feedback in preparation to this being assessed on Quiz 1. The remaining Quiz 1 objectives have to do with the IRAP, the Implicit Relational Assessment Procedure. So next time we meet in class, you'll also hear an article presentation about that, where you'll learn a little bit more. But here's some of the basic info in the meantime. So these two objectives are first to select an RFT explanation of what attitudes are and how they can be measured. And secondly, describe how a participant is asked to respond on the IRAP in the consistent and inconsistent trial blocks and how the results are used to describe implicit attitudes behaviorally. According to relational frame theory, attitudes are relational responses that are established through somebody's learning history. So basically our relational history of reinforcement, what we've learned in terms of our relational history. So in this way, we can think about attitudes as being behavioral because it's somebody's responses in terms of how they're relating different stimuli. So Coke as good and Pepsi as bad would just be one example of that. According to RFT, implicit attitudes can be measured using any sort of procedure that allows us to capture immediate relational responses. So in the presence of those stimuli, it measures the very first relational response that somebody makes before they're able to notice their response or engage in additional relational responses. So for example, if immediately I say Pepsi is bad, then that would be my implicit attitude or my initial relational response. But if you give me a little bit more time, I might still have that covert implicit relational response of Pepsi is bad, but then I might say, well, but I don't want to sound too negative, so I'm actually going to say that I'm not a fan of soda, but Pepsi is okay. That would be more of an explicit attitude, which involves somebody's self-reported attitude. This can be measured on a questionnaire or in an interview or something like that. So both of these involve relational responses. So relating stimuli in terms of what is liked or disliked, things that are good or bad, things that are safe or dangerous, things that I am versus things that I am not. Any sorts of relations like this we can think about in terms of attitudes. The key difference between implicit and explicit would be that the implicit is your initial relational response And then explicit is one that's more based on self-report that's not necessarily immediate. So it can involve multiple relational responses and not necessarily just that immediate one. The implicit relational assessment procedure, or the IRAP, is a procedure that was developed by Dermot Barnes-Holmes and some other relational frame theory researchers a few years ago. And the way that it works is basically presenting two different kinds of trials to a participant to measure their relational responses. And basically the latencies or the speed of responding in these two different conditions are compared to see where the latency is shortest. So the logic is that if somebody has a shorter latency, that this is probably consistent with their learning history. In contrast, if a trial takes longer to respond to, if they have a longer latency, they would argue that this is probably more inconsistent with somebody's learning history because it's taking longer for them to relate. So maybe they had some sort of initial relational response, but then had to make more relational responses in order to get to what the correct response is considered to be correct in that particular condition. So responses on the IRAP are indicative of the strength of responding in a participant's verbal repertoire through the measurement of response latency. So this IRAP and other similar procedures are used to measure somebody's implicit attitudes, that is their immediate relational responses. So because of this, there's usually a really short latency requirement where people have to, for example, respond within a half a second, within 500 milliseconds to each trial. This is to maximize the likelihood that they're actually capturing that initial relational response and not more elaborate relational responses. So, quote unquote, like the more genuine implicit attitude response. So once a participant responds to different trial blocks, the researcher will calculate a difference score that's based on the difference in latency between the participants responding on consistent trial blocks and inconsistent trial blocks. So basically, a consistent trial block is going to be set up in such a way that it involves relations that the experimenter is hypothesizing are consistent with most people's relational histories. So for example, flowers are beautiful, food is delicious, and then an inconsistent might be, for example, wasps are beautiful and garbage is delicious, right? So consistent is going to be something that's in line with what we typically learn socially, and then inconsistent is going to be the flip side of that. There's lots and lots of different IRAP studies, and we're going to hear about one of them the next time we meet in person. And here's just some examples of what those trial blocks look like. So the arrows on this slide indicate which response was considered correct. So whether it was in the presence of the top and the middle words, whether clicking true or clicking false was considered correct during this trial block. The arrows that are here are just indicating what was correct, and they were not actually part of the experiment. So during the consistent trials, participants were asked to respond to terms in a way that reflected a pro-mainstream, anti-BDSM bias. So here they would say that kissing is healthy, so kissing healthy true, but that fetish was not healthy, so fetish healthy false. They would say that kissing was not sick, so kissing sick false, and that fetish was sick, fetish sick true. So this is an example of what the consistent trials look like, consistent blocks. Then, when they completed one trial block of consistent, they would go on to the inconsistent trial block, where they were still looking at the same stimuli, but the way that they had to respond switched. So instead of saying that kissing was healthy, they then had to say that kissing was sick. So kissing healthy false. Fetish healthy true. So here they're saying that all the BDSM related terms are healthy, and all the mainstream sexual terms like kissing, missionary position, caress, things like that are actually sick. So based on this logic, for most folks who are raised in a society and get messages about a certain type of more mainstream sexual practice being more appropriate, we might expect that they would have a shorter latency on the consistent trial blocks, where kissing and things like that are related to as healthy, and then fetish and bondage and things like that are being related to as sick. And then that they would have longer latencies during this inconsistent trial block, where words like kissing and caress are being related to as sick, and then fetish and bondage and words like that are being related to as healthy.